Do you remember Christmas dinner when your grandmother's table groaned under 12 side dishes, each made from scratch the day before? The air smelled of butter, onions, and sweet baking, and every dish had its own special bowl reserved only for Christmas.
You know, child, there was a time when Christmas dinner meant more than a roast and a few rolls. My kitchen used to come alive a whole day before.
In 1950s, 30 side dishes graced tables nationwide. By 1965, families served 8. Today, most offer 3: mashed potatoes, 1 vegetable, and canned rolls. Tonight, we save all 30 before the last grandmothers who cooked them are gone. Walk into any 1950s kitchen on Christmas Eve, and you'd find grandmothers mixing canned corn with eggs, milk, and crushed crackers, creating casserole that transformed simple corn into something rich and custard-like. This economical side cost about 35 cents and fed 8 people with corn that tasted completely different from plain kernels served with butter. Grandmothers made scalloped corn by mixing whole kernel corn with beaten eggs, milk, butter, and saltine cracker crumbs, then baking the mixture until it set into firm casserole that could be sliced like cake. The eggs created custard texture that bound everything together, while the crackers added body and slight crunch on top. The dish had to bake slowly at moderate temperature, or the eggs would curdle, and the texture would turn grainy instead of smooth. Grandmothers learned to trust the timing, 45 minutes at 350 degrees, rather than opening the oven repeatedly to check, understanding that patience created better results than anxious hovering. Creamed pearl onions brought elegance to Christmas tables through tiny white onions swimming in thick cream sauce. This labor-intensive side cost about 50 cents and required peeling dozens of marble-sized onions, teaching patience that separated cooks who cared about presentation from those who took shortcuts. Grandmothers made creamed pearl onions by blanching the tiny onions in boiling water, then slipping off their papery skins one by one, a tedious process that took 30 minutes but created onions that looked perfect and uniform. The peeled onions were simmered in cream sauce made with butter, flour, milk, and a pinch of nutmeg until tender and coated in thick, velvety sauce. The onions had to be cooked gently, or they fell apart and turned mushy. The cream sauce required constant stirring to prevent scorching and lumps. Walk into any 1950s kitchen on Christmas Eve, and you'd find grandmothers mixing lima beans with tomato sauce, onions, and crispy bacon pieces, creating casserole that transformed plain beans into something rich and savory. This economical side cost about 35 cents and fed 8 people with beans that tasted nothing like the plain buttered limas that children complained about. Grandmothers made lima beans in tomato sauce by cooking dried lima beans until tender, then mixing them with homemade tomato sauce, sautéed onions, and crumbled bacon before baking until bubbly. The tomato sauce added acidity that cut through the beans' starchiness, while the bacon provided smoky, salty flavor that made the beans interesting. The beans had to be cooked properly before baking. Candied sweet potatoes brought Southern tradition to Christmas tables nationwide through sweet potatoes baked with butter, brown sugar, and sometimes marshmallows on top. This sweet savory side cost about 45 cents and created dish that children loved because it tasted like dessert but counted as vegetable. Grandmothers made candied sweet potatoes by boiling sweet potatoes until tender, slicing them into rounds, layering them in a baking dish with butter and brown sugar, then baking until the sugar melted into thick syrup. Some grandmothers topped the potatoes with marshmallows during the last 10 minutes of baking, creating browned, gooey topping that made children excited about eating vegetables. The sweet potatoes had to be cooked just until tender. Overcooked potatoes turned mushy and fell apart when sliced, while undercooked potatoes stayed hard even after baking with sugar. Harvard beets brought jewel-toned color to Christmas plates through beets cooked in sweet-sour sauce made with vinegar and sugar. This traditional side cost about 30 cents and created vegetable that even beet haters sometimes tolerated because the sauce balanced beets' earthy flavor. Grandmothers made Harvard beets by cooking sliced beets in sauce made from sugar, cornstarch, vinegar, and butter, creating glossy coating that clung to each beet slice. The sauce had to be cooked until it thickened and turned from cloudy to clear, signaling that the cornstarch had cooked properly and wouldn't taste raw. The vinegar amount had to be balanced carefully. Too much, and the beets tasted pickled; too little, and they were just sweet without the tang that made Harvard beets distinctive. 5 sides down, the table's starting to fill, corn becoming custard, tiny onions peeled one by one, green beans meeting cream of mushroom soup, sweet potatoes candy-coated, beets balanced between sweet and sour. Your grandmother understood that vegetables weren't punishment. They were opportunity to show skill and care. 25 more dishes complete Christmas dinner. Broccoli with Hollandaise sauce brought French elegance to American Christmas tables through rich butter sauce that made even vegetable-hating children willing to try green trees on their plates. This fancy side cost about 60 cents and demonstrated that grandmother could cook restaurant-quality food at home. Grandmothers made Hollandaise sauce by whisking egg yolks with lemon juice over simmering water, then slowly adding melted butter while whisking constantly until the mixture thickened into smooth, pale yellow sauce. The technique required patience and attention. If the heat was too high, the eggs scrambled. If you added butter too fast, the sauce broke and separated into greasy mess. The broccoli had to be cooked just until bright green and tender crisp, then drained completely before adding sauce, or the water would thin the hollandaise and ruin its thick, luxurious texture. Orange glazed carrots brought brightness and sweetness to Christmas plates through carrots, cooked with orange juice, butter, and brown sugar until they were tender and coated in shiny glaze. This colorful side cost about 30 cents and created vegetable that looked as good as it tasted. Grandmothers made orange glazed carrots by slicing carrots into coins or sticks, then cooking them in mixture of orange juice, butter, brown sugar, and sometimes a little orange zest until the carrots were tender and the liquid had reduced to thick glaze. The reduction took patience. You couldn't rush it or the glaze wouldn't thicken properly. The carrots had to be cut uniformly so they cooked evenly. Thick pieces stayed hard while thin pieces turned mushy if the sizes varied too much. This uniform cutting demonstrated knife skills and attention to detail that separated careful cooks from careless ones. Oyster dressing brought coastal tradition inland through fresh oysters mixed into bread stuffing, creating side dish that was controversial. People either loved it passionately or refused to eat it entirely. This expensive side cost about $2 and appeared primarily in families where grandmother had grown up near the ocean. Grandmothers made oyster dressing by mixing torn bread with sautéed celery and onions, chicken broth, and fresh oysters with their liquid, then baking the mixture until the top was crispy and the inside was moist. The oysters had to be fresh. Canned oysters created rubbery texture and tinny flavor that announced shortcuts and disappointed oyster dressing lovers. The oyster liquid added crucial flavor and moisture, so grandmothers were careful not to drain it away. The liquid also meant the dressing needed less added broth than plain bread dressing, requiring adjustment in proportions that came from experience rather than following recipes exactly. Succotash brought Native American tradition to Christmas tables through lima beans and corn cooked together with butter and cream. This historical side cost about 40 cents and connected families to American culinary heritage that predated European settlement. Grandmothers made succotash by cooking lima beans until tender, adding corn kernels and cooking just until the corn was heated through, then stirring in butter and cream to create rich, cohesive dish rather than just mixed vegetables. The cream bound the vegetables together and created sauce that coated each kernel and bean. The lima beans had to be cooked properly. Undercooked limas were hard and chalky. Overcooked limas turned mushy and fell apart. The narrow window of perfect doneness required attention and experience, with grandmothers learning to test beans by biting them rather than trusting timing alone. Twice-baked potatoes brought restaurant elegance to home Christmas dinners through potatoes baked, scooped out, mashed with butter and sour cream, then returned to their shells and baked again. This labor-intensive side cost about 50 cents and created individual servings that looked impressive and special. Grandmothers made twice-baked potatoes by baking large russet potatoes until tender, cutting them in half lengthwise, carefully scooping out the insides without tearing the skins, mashing the potato with butter, sour cream, cheese, and seasonings, then piling the mixture back into the shells and baking again until the tops were golden and slightly crispy. The potato skins had to remain intact to serve as edible bowls. Torn skins meant the filling leaked out and created mess, rather than neat individual servings. This careful scooping required patience and gentle touch that separated skilled cooks from those who rushed and ruined the presentation. The twice-baked potatoes could be assembled a day ahead and refrigerated until baking time. Rehook 10 sides down, and complexity builds. Hollandaise whisked over simmering water. Carrots glazed until shiny. Oysters dividing families. Lima beans and corn honoring native tradition. Potatoes baked twice for elegance. She wasn't just cooking vegetables. She was creating theater, honoring history and proving that sides mattered as much as the turkey. 20 more dishes ahead. Celery. Victor brought San Francisco sophistication to Christmas tables through braised celery hearts served cold with anchovy dressing. This unusual side cost about 45 cents and represented the kind of adventurous cooking that characterized 1950s entertaining when trying new things seemed exciting rather than risky. Grandmothers made Celery Victor by trimming celery hearts, the pale, tender inner stalks, then braising them in chicken broth until tender but not mushy. The braised celery was chilled, then served cold with dressing made from olive oil, vinegar, anchovies, and capers. The dish was named after Victor Hertzler, chef at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel, who created it in the early 1900s. The celery had to be cooked just until tender. Overcooked celery turned stringy and unpleasant, while undercooked celery was too crunchy and hard to eat elegantly. Creamed spinach transformed the vegetable that children famously hated into something rich and almost acceptable through thick cream sauce that masked spinach's strong flavor and slimy texture. This classic side cost about 35 cents and represented the belief that cream could make anything palatable. Grandmothers made creamed spinach by cooking fresh spinach until wilted, squeezing out excess water, chopping it fine, then stirring it into cream sauce made with butter, flour, milk, and nutmeg. The squeezing step was essential. Spinach held enormous amounts of water that would thin the cream sauce and create watery mess if not removed. The cream sauce had to be thick enough to coat the spinach without being so thick it became gluey paste. This balance required cooking the flour and butter together properly before adding milk, then cooking until the sauce reached the right consistency, thick enough to cling to a spoon, but thin enough to pour. The nutmeg was essential. Without it, creamed spinach was just spinach in white sauce. Glazed parsnips brought medieval vegetable into 1950s Christmas dinners through parsnips roasted with butter and brown sugar until caramelized and sweet. This old-fashioned side cost about 30 cents and appealed to people who appreciated vegetables that tasted sweet without being dessert. Grandmothers made glazed parsnips by peeling and cutting parsnips into sticks or coins, tossing them with melted butter and brown sugar, then roasting at high heat until the parsnips were tender and the sugar had caramelized into shiny glaze. The high heat was essential. Low heat steamed the parsnips instead of caramelizing them, creating different texture and flavor. The parsnips had to be cut uniformly so they cooked evenly. Thick pieces stayed hard, while thin pieces burned if the sizes varied. The uniform cutting demonstrated the same knife skills that orange-glazed carrots required, showing that this wasn't unique skill, but rather basic technique that applied across multiple dishes. The parsnip's natural sweetness intensified during roasting, creating vegetable that tasted almost like dessert, but that counted as side dish. This sweet vegetable category appealed to children who needed coaxing to eat vegetables and to adults who appreciated that not all vegetables had to taste savory. Glazed parsnips appeared primarily in households where grandmothers had British heritage or where root vegetables were common winter staples. The regional and ethnic variation meant parsnips were familiar in some areas and unknown in others, creating geographic differences in what vegetables appeared at Christmas dinner. Corn pudding created the richest, most custard-like corn side through corn kernels baked with eggs, cream, and butter until set into pudding that was almost like corn-flavored flan. This southern specialty cost about 50 cents and created side dish so rich that small servings satisfied completely. Grandmothers made corn pudding by mixing corn kernels, fresh cut from cobs when available, canned when not, with beaten eggs, heavy cream, melted butter, sugar, and a little flour for structure, then baking the mixture until it set into firm pudding that could be scooped like casserole. The eggs and cream created custard texture that was smooth and rich. The pudding had to bake at moderate temperature in a water bath, or the eggs would curdle and the texture would turn grainy and unpleasant. The water bath, setting the baking dish in a larger pan of hot water, created gentle, even heat that cooked the custard slowly and prevented curdling. The sugar amount was crucial. Too much, and the pudding tasted like dessert rather than side dish. Too little, and it tasted flat and bland. The balance between sweet and savory had to be calibrated carefully, with most recipes using just 2 tablespoons of sugar for an entire dish, enough to enhance corn's natural sweetness without making it candy-like. Corn pudding appeared primarily in southern states, where corn was staple crop, and where custard-based sides were common. The regional concentration meant many northern families had never heard of corn pudding, creating surprise when they encountered it at southern relatives' Christmas dinners. Brussels sprouts with chestnuts brought European Christmas tradition to American tables through tiny cabbages paired with sweet chestnuts. This elegant side cost about 75 cents and represented the kind of sophisticated vegetable combination that characterized fancy holiday meals. Grandmothers made Brussels sprouts with chestnuts by roasting chestnuts until the shells split, peeling them while still hot, a painful process that left fingers burned, then cutting the peeled chestnuts into pieces and tossing them with cooked Brussels sprouts and butter. The chestnuts added sweetness and interesting texture that made Brussels sprouts more appealing. The Brussels sprouts had to be cooked just until tender. Overcooked sprouts turned mushy and developed sulphurous smell that made the whole house stink, while undercooked sprouts were too hard and bitter. The narrow window of perfect doneness required attention and experience. The chestnut peeling was the hardest part. The inner brown skin clung to the nut meat and had to be scraped away, creating tedious work that took patience and determination. Some grandmothers bought pre-peeled chestnuts in jars, accepting the higher cost in exchange for avoiding the painful peeling process. Brussels sprouts with chestnuts appeared primarily in households where grandmothers had European heritage or where serving elegant, sophisticated sides mattered for status and presentation. The dish announced that your Christmas dinner was refined and that your family valued culinary sophistication over simple, plain food. 15 sides, halfway done, celery braised in broth, spinach hidden in cream, parsnips caramelized like candy, corn transformed into pudding, Brussels sprouts paired with painful-to-peel chestnuts. Every dish taught something about technique, about history, about the belief that vegetables deserved as much attention as meat. 15 more sides complete the feast. Mushroom rice pilaf brought restaurant elegance to Christmas tables through rice cooked with mushrooms, onions, and chicken broth until fluffy and flavorful. This sophisticated side cost about 50 cents and created rice dish that was far more interesting than plain white rice with butter. Grandmothers made mushroom rice pilaf by sautéing sliced mushrooms and diced onions in butter until the mushrooms released their liquid and browned slightly, then adding long-grain white rice and stirring to coat each grain with butter. Chicken broth was added, 2 cups of broth for every cup of rice, and the mixture was brought to a boil, then covered and simmered until the rice absorbed all the liquid and became tender and fluffy. The rice had to be cooked without lifting the lid. Every time you lifted the lid, steam escaped, and the rice took longer to cook. This hands-off cooking required trust and patience, understanding that the rice would cook properly if left alone, but would turn out unevenly if constantly checked. The mushrooms added earthy flavor and meaty texture that made the pilaf substantial enough to be satisfying rather than just filler. The chicken broth created much more flavor than cooking rice in plain water, demonstrating that the cooking liquid mattered as much as the rice itself. Mushroom rice pilaf appeared at Christmas dinner in households where rice was preferred over potatoes, where sophisticated sides mattered, and where European-influenced cooking was appreciated. The pilaf method, cooking rice in broth rather than water, represented culinary knowledge that separated experienced cooks from those who just boiled rice like pasta. Acorn squash with brown sugar brought autumn harvest to Christmas tables through squash halves baked with butter and brown sugar until tender and caramelized. This simple side cost about 40 cents and created individual servings that looked impressive despite minimal preparation. Grandmothers made acorn squash with brown sugar by cutting squash in half, scooping out seeds, placing butter and brown sugar in each cavity, then baking until the squash was tender and the sugar had melted into syrup. The simplicity meant even inexperienced cooks could succeed, making this one of the most accessible, fancy-looking sides. The squash had to be cut carefully. The hard shell and rounded shape made cutting dangerous, with knives slipping and potentially causing injury. Grandmothers learned to use heavy chef's knives and to cut slowly and carefully, understanding that rushing created danger. The timing varied based on squash size. Small squash cooked in 45 minutes. Large ones needed over an hour. This variation meant grandmothers had to test for doneness by piercing with a fork. Peas with pearl onions brought classic French combination to American Christmas tables through tiny peas and tiny onions cooked together with butter. This elegant side cost about 50 cents and created vegetable dish that looked refined and special despite simple preparation. Grandmothers made peas with pearl onions by cooking pearl onions until tender, adding frozen peas, and cooking just until the peas were heated through and bright green, then tossing everything with butter and sometimes a little cream. The key was not overcooking the peas. They needed just 2 or 3 minutes, or they turned dull green and mushy. Sweet and sour red cabbage brought German tradition to Christmas tables through red cabbage braised with vinegar, sugar, and apples until tender and deeply flavored. This distinctive side cost about 30 cents and created vegetable that was bright purple and intensely flavored. Grandmothers made sweet and sour red cabbage by shredding red cabbage, then cooking it slowly with sliced apples, vinegar, sugar, butter, and sometimes red wine until the cabbage was very tender and the flavors had melded together. The long cooking, often 2 hours, broke down the cabbage's tough fibers and created complex flavor that was both sweet and sour. The vinegar amount had to be balanced carefully with sugar to create the characteristic sweet-sour flavor. Too much vinegar and the cabbage tasted pickled, too much sugar and it tasted like candy. The balance was crucial to the dish's identity and required tasting and adjusting during cooking. Mashed turnips brought humble root vegetable to Christmas tables through turnips mashed with butter and cream until smooth and mild flavored. This economical side cost about 25 cents and created alternative to mashed potatoes that was lighter and less filling. Grandmothers made mashed turnips by peeling and cubing turnips, boiling them until very tender, draining thoroughly, then mashing with butter, cream, salt and pepper until smooth. Some grandmothers mixed turnips with potatoes, half turnips, half potatoes, creating hybrid that was milder than pure turnips, but more interesting than plain potatoes. The turnips had to be drained completely after cooking, or the excess water would make the mashed turnips watery and thin. The thorough draining required letting the cooked turnips sit in the colander for several minutes. Plain mashed turnips tasted too strong and bitter for most people, but properly enriched turnips were mild and pleasant, with just slight edge that made them more interesting than bland mashed potatoes. Mashed turnips appeared primarily in rural areas where root vegetables were winter staples and where turnips were common crop. The regional concentration meant city families often had never eaten turnips, creating urban-rural divide in what vegetables appeared at Christmas dinner. 20 sides down, 10 remaining. Mac and cheese comforting children, squash halves filled with butter and sugar, peas staying bright green, red cabbage staining everything purple, turnips mashed smooth. Your grandmother knew that variety mattered, that different people needed different foods, that Christmas dinner should offer something for everyone, child and adult, adventurous and cautious. 10 final sides complete the table. Scalloped potatoes represented the ultimate comfort side dish. Thin potato slices baked in cream sauce until tender and golden, creating casserole that was rich, filling, and universally loved, even by people who claimed not to like vegetables. This classic side cost about 40 cents and fed 8 to 10 people with potatoes so rich and creamy that small servings satisfied completely. The dish required advance planning because it baked for over an hour, meaning it had to go in the oven early enough to be ready when dinner was served, but not so early that it dried out while waiting. Grandmothers made scalloped potatoes by slicing raw potatoes very thin, about 1/8 inch thick, then layering them in a buttered baking dish with cream sauce, repeating the layers until the dish was full. The cream sauce was made from butter, flour, and milk, cooked until thick, then seasoned with salt, pepper. The potato slicing was crucial. Uniform thickness meant even cooking, while varied thickness created some slices that were mushy and others that stayed hard. Grandmothers who owned mandolin slicers could create perfectly uniform slices quickly. The layering technique mattered. Each layer of potatoes had to be seasoned individually with salt and pepper, and cream sauce had to be distributed evenly throughout, rather than just poured over the top. This careful layering created consistent flavor and texture throughout the dish, rather than bland potatoes on bottom and over-seasoned ones on top. The dish had to rest for 10 minutes after coming out of the oven before serving, allowing the sauce to thicken and the layers to set. Scalloped potatoes appeared at nearly every 1950s Christmas dinner because they were reliable, crowd-pleasing, and substantial enough to satisfy hungry guests. Universality meant that scalloped potatoes became so standard they were almost invisible. Expected rather than special, appreciated rather than exciting. The dish taught important lessons about patience, that slow cooking created better results than rushing. Creamed onions represented the most polarizing Christmas side dish. People either loved them passionately or refused to eat them entirely, with no middle ground of polite tolerance. The dish required peeling dozens of small onions, creating labor that demonstrated commitment to tradition despite the tears and tedium. This controversial side cost about 50 cents and created dish that was creamy, oniony, and strongly flavored enough that it dominated everything else on your plate. The onions, swimming in thick cream sauce, looked elegant and refined, but tasted assertive and bold, creating disconnect between appearance and flavor intensity. Grandmothers made creamed onions by peeling small white onions, not tiny pearl onions, but slightly larger boiling onions, about walnut-sized, then simmering them in salted water until tender, no matter how many tricks grandmothers tried to prevent it. The cream sauce was made separately from butter, flour, and milk, cooked until thick and smooth, then seasoned with salt, white pepper, and sometimes a pinch of nutmeg. The sauce had to be thick enough to coat the onions without being so thick it became gluey paste, requiring the same careful cooking that all cream sauces demanded. The onions were drained thoroughly after cooking, then combined with the cream sauce and reheated gently. The thorough draining was essential. Any water clinging to the onions would thin the cream sauce and create watery dish instead of thick, luxurious one. Some grandmothers added frozen peas to creamed onions during the last few minutes of cooking, creating peas and onions in cream sauce. This variation made the dish more acceptable to onion skeptics while maintaining the essential character. Creamed onions appeared at Christmas dinner in households where tradition mattered more than universal appeal, where serving the same sides every year was more important than ensuring everyone liked everything. The dish's controversial status created family stories about who loved it and who refused to eat it, with these food preferences becoming part of family lore. The dish taught lessons about acquired tastes, that some foods required multiple exposures before you learned to appreciate them, that childhood food dislikes sometimes persisted into adulthood, and that family food traditions sometimes included dishes that not everyone enjoyed, but that everyone recognized as essential to the meal's identity. Wild rice stuffing brought expensive, sophisticated grain to Christmas tables through wild rice mixed with mushrooms, celery, and herbs, creating stuffing that was more elegant and refined than plain bread stuffing. This luxury side cost about $1.50, expensive for 1950s side dish, and announced that your Christmas dinner was special enough to justify splurging on premium ingredients. Wild rice wasn't actually rice, but rather seed from aquatic grass that grew in lakes and rivers in Minnesota and nearby states. The limited growing area and hand-harvesting method made wild rice expensive and exotic, creating an ingredient that most families used only at holidays when splurging seemed appropriate. Grandmothers made wild rice stuffing by cooking wild rice in chicken broth until tender, a process that took 45 minutes to an hour because wild rice took much longer to cook than white rice. While the rice cooked, they sautéed chopped celery, onions, and mushrooms in butter until soft, then mixed the sautéed vegetables with the cooked rice, adding fresh herbs like sage and thyme, and sometimes toasted pecans or dried cranberries for additional flavor and texture. This distinctive character meant wild rice stuffing tasted sophisticated and special, creating side dish that seemed restaurant quality despite being made at home. Stuffing could be baked in a casserole dish or used to stuff the turkey, though most grandmothers baked it separately because stuffing cooked inside the turkey took longer and created food safety concerns. Wild rice stuffing appeared primarily in wealthy households or in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where wild rice was regional specialty and point of pride. The geographic and economic concentration meant many families had never tasted wild rice, creating class and regional divisions in what appeared at Christmas dinner. The dish taught lessons about luxury and special occasions, that some ingredients were too expensive for everyday use but appropriate for holidays, that splurging on premium ingredients created memorable meals, and that the occasional extravagance was justified by the importance of the occasion and the memories created. Wild rice stuffing also taught about regional ingredients and food identity, that some foods were tied to specific places, that local specialties created regional pride, and that serving regional ingredients announced connection to place and celebration of local food culture. The dish represented Minnesota and Wisconsin identity in ways that transcended simple side dish into statement about where you were from and what you valued. This is the side dish the hook promised would show you what patience meant. French-style green beans requiring 3 types of onions and cream, so thick it had to be stirred constantly to prevent scorching. French-style green beans represented the peak of 1950s vegetable sophistication, transforming simple green beans into elegant side dish through careful preparation and rich cream sauce flavored with multiple members of the onion family. This labor-intensive creation cost about 75 cents and created side dish that looked and tasted like it belonged in French restaurant rather than home kitchen. Grandmothers made French-style green beans by trimming fresh green beans, not the thick, tough beans, but thin, tender ones called haricots verts, then blanching them briefly in boiling salted water until bright green and crisp tender. While the beans cooked, they prepared the sauce using 3 types of onions, minced shallots sautéed in butter until soft, thinly sliced white onion cooked until translucent, and chopped green onion tops added at the end for fresh onion flavor and bright green color. The cream sauce started with the sautéed shallots and onions, then heavy cream was added, and the mixture was cooked down until very thick enough to coat the back of a spoon and not run off. This reduction required constant stirring to prevent the cream from scorching on the bottom of the pan, creating arm fatigue that announced this wasn't simple side dish, but rather labor of love. The blanched green beans were added to the reduced cream sauce and tossed to coat. Then the green onion tops were stirred in just before serving to maintain their bright color and fresh flavor. The timing had to be precise. The dish had to be made at the last minute because the cream sauce couldn't be made ahead and reheated without separating, and the beans couldn't sit in the sauce or they would lose their bright color and crisp, tender texture. This last-minute preparation added stress to Christmas dinner timing, but created results that were dramatically better than sides that could be made ahead. French-style green beans appeared primarily in households where grandmother had culinary ambitions and wanted to demonstrate sophisticated cooking skills, where serving French-influenced food announced cultural refinement, and where the extra labor was justified by the impressive results. The dish separated confident cooks from those who stuck to simple, reliable sides that didn't risk failure. The 3-onion requirement taught lessons about flavor layering, that using multiple varieties of the same ingredient created more complex, interesting results than using just one. Baked beans brought New England tradition to Christmas tables nationwide through navy beans slow-baked with molasses, brown sugar, and salt pork until thick and deeply flavored. This economical side cost about 40 cents and created dish that was substantial enough to be main course, but that served as side dish at Christmas dinner. Boston-style baked beans required advanced planning because the beans needed overnight soaking, then 6 to 8 hours of slow baking, meaning grandmothers had to start preparation 2 days before Christmas dinner. This extended timeline taught planning skills and demonstrated that some traditional foods couldn't be rushed or made at the last minute. Grandmothers made Boston baked beans by soaking dried navy beans overnight, then draining and mixing them with molasses, brown sugar, dry mustard, and chunks of salt pork, covering everything with water, and baking in a covered pot at very low temperature for 6 to 8 hours. The long, slow cooking broke down the beans' tough skins and allowed the flavors to meld together into cohesive, deeply flavored dish. The salt pork was essential. It provided fat and savory flavor that balanced the molasses' sweetness and created richness that plain beans lacked. The pork melted during the long cooking, distributing its fat throughout the beans and creating unctuousness that made the beans satisfying and filling. The beans had to be checked periodically during baking and additional water added if they started to dry out. This monitoring required being home all day while the beans cooked, creating constraint that modern cooks would find unacceptable but that 1950s grandmothers accepted as normal part of holiday preparation. The beans were best made a day ahead and reheated, allowing the flavors to develop overnight and the sauce to thicken as it cooled. This make-ahead quality made baked beans practical despite their long cooking time, with grandmothers appreciating that one Christmas preparation could be completed well before the last-minute rush. Baked beans appeared at Christmas dinner primarily in New England households where they were regional specialty and point of pride, and in households where substantial, filling sides were valued over delicate, refined ones. The regional and class associations meant baked beans announced working-class, New England identity rather than aspirational sophistication. The dish taught lessons about slow cooking and patience, that some foods required time to develop their full flavor, that rushing created inferior results, and that the best cooking often meant starting early and allowing time to work its magic. These lessons extended beyond beans into general cooking philosophy about the value of patience. Baked beans also taught about advanced planning and time management, that complex holiday meals required thinking ahead, that some dishes had to be started days before serving, and that successful entertaining meant managing multiple timelines simultaneously rather than trying to prepare everything at the last minute. 25 sides, 5 remaining. You've watched potatoes sliced thin and layered, onions peeled until tears flowed, wild rice announcing luxury, green beans bathed in 3-onion cream, beans baked for 8 hours. She understood that sides weren't afterthoughts. They were the meal's architecture, creating variety, color, texture, and proof that Christmas dinner mattered enough to justify days of work. 5 final sides complete the legacy. Rutabaga mash brought Scandinavian tradition to American Christmas tables through the yellow root vegetable that most Americans had never heard of, but that Swedish and Norwegian families considered essential Christmas side. This ethnic specialty cost about 30 cents and created side dish that was slightly sweet, slightly bitter, and completely distinctive. Rutabaga, also called Swede or yellow turnip, was larger and yellower than regular turnips, with waxy skin that had to be peeled away to reveal orange-yellow flesh underneath. The vegetable was dense and hard when raw, requiring substantial knife skills and strength to cut into pieces for cooking. Grandmothers made rutabaga mash by peeling and cubing rutabagas, boiling them until very tender, draining thoroughly, then mashing with butter, cream, salt, pepper, and sometimes a little brown sugar or maple syrup to balance the vegetable's natural bitterness. The mashing had to be thorough. Rutabagas were fibrous and required more work to achieve smooth consistency than potatoes did. Some grandmothers mixed rutabagas with carrots or potatoes, creating hybrid mash that was milder than pure rutabaga but more interesting than plain potatoes. The mixing also created attractive orange color that made the dish visually appealing and helped disguise the rutabaga for family members who were suspicious of unfamiliar vegetables. The rutabaga's flavor was distinctive, slightly sweet, slightly bitter, with earthy undertones that some people loved and others found too strong. This polarizing quality meant rutabaga mash had devoted fans but wasn't universally appreciated, creating the same divided reactions that creamed onions and oyster dressing generated. Rutabaga mash appeared primarily in Scandinavian American households in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, where Swedish and Norwegian immigrants had settled and maintained food traditions from their homelands. The ethnic and geographic specificity meant many Americans had never encountered rutabaga, creating cultural divide between those who considered it essential Christmas food and those who'd never heard of it. The dish taught lessons about ethnic food preservation, that immigrant communities maintained traditional foods even when the broader American culture didn't recognize or value them, that food traditions connected families to ancestral homelands, and that ethnic identity was expressed and preserved through continuing to cook and eat traditional foods. Rutabaga mash also taught about acquired tastes and cultural food preferences, that what seemed normal and delicious to one ethnic group seemed strange and unappetizing to others, that food preferences were learned through childhood exposure rather than being universal, and that expanding your food horizons required willingness to try unfamiliar things multiple times before judging them. The dish represented the ethnic diversity of American food culture, showing how different immigrant groups brought their traditions and how these traditions coexisted in the broader American food landscape despite remaining unknown to people outside the specific ethnic communities that maintained them. Cauliflower with cheese sauce transformed the mild white vegetable into something rich and appealing through thick cheddar cheese sauce that made even cauliflower haters willing to try it. This crowd-pleasing side cost about 45 cents and demonstrated the 1950s belief that cheese sauce could make any vegetable acceptable. Cauliflower was a controversial vegetable. When cooked properly, it was mild and pleasant, but when overcooked, it developed sulfurous smell that made the whole house stink and created mushy texture that was unpleasant to eat. The narrow window between undercooked hard and overcooked mushy required attention and experience. Grandmothers made cauliflower with cheese sauce by breaking cauliflower into florets and steaming or boiling them until just tender, still slightly firm when pierced with a fork but not crunchy. While the cauliflower cooked, they made cheese sauce from butter, flour, milk, and sharp cheddar cheese, cooking until smooth and thick. The cheese sauce required the same careful technique that all cream sauces demanded, cooking the flour and butter together before adding milk, stirring constantly to prevent lumps, adding cheese after the sauce had thickened, and cooking just until the cheese melted. Adding cheese too early or cooking it too long created grainy, separated sauce instead of smooth, creamy one. The cauliflower had to be drained completely before adding sauce, or the water clinging to the florets would thin the cheese sauce and create watery dish. Some grandmothers returned the drained cauliflower to the hot pot for a moment to evaporate any remaining moisture, ensuring the florets were completely dry before saucing. The dish was assembled in a serving bowl with cauliflower on bottom and cheese sauce poured over top, or mixed together so every floret was coated. Some grandmothers topped the sauced cauliflower with buttered breadcrumbs and ran it under the broiler briefly to create crispy topping, elevating simple side dish into something more special. Cauliflower with cheese sauce appeared at Christmas dinner in households with children who needed familiar, cheese-covered vegetables to balance the unfamiliar holiday sides. The inclusion acknowledged that not all Christmas foods had to be traditional or special, that sometimes comfort and familiarity mattered more than authenticity or sophistication. The dish taught lessons about making vegetables appealing, that rich sauce could overcome vegetable resistance, that presentation and preparation mattered as much as the vegetable itself, and that meeting people where they were with food they'd actually eat was more important than forcing them to eat things they hated in the name of tradition or nutrition. Cauliflower with cheese sauce also taught about the 1950s approach to vegetables, that plain steamed vegetables were considered boring and unappetizing, that vegetables needed enhancement through butter, cream, or cheese sauce to be acceptable, and that the goal was making vegetables palatable rather than celebrating their natural flavors. This philosophy would change in later decades as attitudes about vegetables shifted toward lighter preparation and appreciation of natural flavors. Molded cranberry sauce brought jewel-toned elegance to Christmas tables through cranberries cooked with sugar and orange, then set in decorative molds that created beautiful shapes when unmolded onto serving plates. This festive side cost about 40 cents and created one of the few Christmas sides that was both traditional and visually dramatic. Cranberry sauce existed in two forms: the simple version where whole cranberries were cooked with sugar until they burst and the mixture thickened naturally, and the molded version where the cranberries were strained after cooking to remove skins, gelatin was added, and the smooth mixture was poured into molds to set into firm shapes that could be sliced. Grandmothers made molded cranberry sauce by cooking fresh cranberries with sugar, orange juice, and orange zest until the berries burst and the mixture was thick. The cooked cranberries were pressed through a sieve or food mill to remove the skins and create smooth puree. Then gelatin dissolved in water was stirred in, and the mixture was poured into decorative molds, often ring molds or individual molds shaped like stars or flowers. The molds had to be lightly oiled before filling, or the cranberry mixture would stick and refuse to release when unmolded. The oiling had to be light. Too much oil created greasy film on the finished sauce, while too little meant the sauce stuck and had to be scraped out rather than sliding out smoothly. The cranberry mixture had to cool to room temperature before going into the refrigerator, or condensation would form and create water droplets that marred the smooth surface. The cooling and setting took at least 4 hours, preferably overnight, requiring advanced planning and patience. The unmolding was the dramatic moment. The mold was dipped briefly in warm water to loosen the edges, then inverted onto a serving plate and lifted away, revealing the shaped cranberry sauce underneath. Successful unmolding created smooth, perfect shape that looked professional and impressive, while failed unmolding created cracked, collapsed mess that had to be served anyway, despite looking terrible. Molded cranberry sauce appeared at nearly every 1950s Christmas dinner because cranberries were traditional Thanksgiving and Christmas food, because the bright red color looked festive and holiday appropriate, and because the sweet tart flavor cut through the richness of turkey and gravy and provided palate-cleansing contrast. The dish taught lessons about presentation and drama, that food could be theater, that the visual reveal of unmolding created excitement and anticipation, and that taking extra steps to make food look special elevated the entire meal beyond just eating into experience and event. Waldorf salad brought New York sophistication to Christmas tables nationwide through apples, celery, walnuts, and mayonnaise, creating crunchy, creamy side dish that was technically salad but served as vegetable side. This elegant creation cost about 60 cents and represented the kind of composed salad that characterized fancy 1950s entertaining. The salad was created at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel in the 1890s, giving it prestigious pedigree that made it seem sophisticated and worldly despite simple ingredients. Serving Waldorf salad announced that your family knew fine dining traditions and appreciated culinary history. Grandmothers made Waldorf salad by cutting crisp apples into small cubes, leaving the red peel on for color, then tossing them immediately with lemon juice to prevent browning. Celery was cut into similarly sized pieces, walnuts were toasted and chopped, and everything was mixed with mayonnaise and sometimes a little sugar to create creamy, crunchy mixture. The apples had to be cut just before serving, or they would brown despite the lemon juice, creating unattractive discoloration that announced the salad had been made too far in advance. This last-minute preparation meant Waldorf salad added to Christmas morning's rush, but created results that looked fresh and appealing rather than tired and brown. The walnut toasting was essential. Raw walnuts tasted flat and slightly bitter, but toasted walnuts had rich, deep flavor that made the salad special. The toasting took just a few minutes in a dry skillet, but required attention because nuts could burn suddenly if left unattended. Some grandmothers added grapes, raisins, or miniature marshmallows to Waldorf salad, creating variations that were sweeter and more dessert-like than the original version. These additions made the salad more appealing to children, but less sophisticated and traditional to purists who insisted proper Waldorf salad contained only apples, celery, walnuts, and mayonnaise. Waldorf salad appeared at Christmas dinner as one of several salad options, representing the 1950s custom of serving multiple salads alongside vegetable sides. The salad course was considered essential to proper dinner, with the variety of salads announcing that the hostess understood proper meal structure and formal dining customs. Parker House rolls completed the Christmas side dish collection. Not technically a side dish, but rather bread that appeared alongside sides, and that was essential enough to Christmas dinner that its absence would be noticed and commented on. These folded yeast rolls cost about 30 cents for ingredients and required skills that separated accomplished bakers from those who struggled with yeast. Parker House rolls were created at Boston's Parker House Hotel in the 1870s, giving them the same kind of prestigious pedigree that Waldorf salad enjoyed. The distinctive folded shape, dough circles brushed with butter and folded in half, created rolls that were tender, buttery, and elegant enough for the fanciest occasions. Grandmothers made Parker House rolls by preparing yeast dough with milk, butter, eggs, and flour, letting it rise until doubled, rolling it out and cutting circles with a biscuit cutter, brushing each circle with melted butter, folding it in half, and letting the shaped rolls rise again before baking. The double rising was essential. Skipping the second rise created dense, heavy rolls instead of light, fluffy ones. The yeast had to be proofed properly, dissolved in warm water with a little sugar and allowed to foam, proving it was alive and active. Dead yeast created dough that never rose, wasting time and ingredients and leaving the baker with dense, inedible results. The proofing step prevented this disaster by confirming the yeast was viable before committing to the full recipe. Parker House rolls appeared at nearly every formal 1950s Christmas dinner because bread was considered essential to proper meal, because the elegant folded shape announced sophisticated baking skills, and because the buttery richness made them special enough for holiday celebration rather than everyday eating. The rolls taught lessons about yeast baking, that working with living organisms required patience and attention, that rushing created failure, that proper technique mattered more than expensive ingredients, and that mastering yeast baking was mark of accomplished cook who'd invested time in learning fundamental skills. Parker House Rolls also taught about the 1950s emphasis on homemade bread, that serving bakery rolls announced either lack of skill or lack of caring, that homemade rolls demonstrated that Christmas dinner mattered enough to justify the extra work, and that bread baking ability was expected of accomplished homemakers rather than being optional specialty skill. Which of these 30 Christmas side dishes did your grandmother make in the 1950s? Comment the dish name and your state. I'm mapping where these holiday traditions persisted longest and which regions abandoned them first as convenience foods replaced the from-scratch cooking that defined grandmother's Christmas preparation. If you made it through all 30 side dishes, you understand that 1950s grandmothers weren't just making vegetables and starches. They were creating the architecture of Christmas dinner, building variety and color and texture that made the meal memorable and special, demonstrating that sides mattered as much as the turkey, and that Christmas dinner required days of planning and preparation, not just heating up a few cans.